Milwaukee Bucks fans, welcome back to Bucks Latest presented by Fan Arch. I'm your host, Dean Simon. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and also turn on those post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates. We are still very much on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so if you could press that big red subscribe button, I would really, really appreciate it. All right, so the Milwaukee Bucks preseason schedule has officially been announced. They will have 4 preseason contests going from October 6th to the 14th. And it's coming up a little bit sooner than some may realize. We're going to actually have a chance to talk about actual Milwaukee Bucks basketball somewhat soon enough. For the first time since the summer league. Of course, we're all hungry for actual Bucks basketball, and sure enough, it's going to be here at some point soon. But anyways, starting October 6th, their first matchup, and by the way, the first 3 of 4 matchups in the preseason for the Milwaukee Bucks, they'll be against fellow Eastern Conference teams. And at that, Eastern Conference teams that are going to be somewhat competitive this year. I mean, other than one, and that's the Chicago Bulls, which, we'll get into the specific matchups in a second. But uh, the first game is going to be, again, starting October 6th, we'll be on the road against the Miami Heat. So, that'll be a good team to kind of scat out, and really you'll get a chance to see how well you fare against other somewhat up and coming Eastern Conference teams. The Miami Heat want to compete every single year, and of course, after acquiring Norman Powell, and they'll have Tyler Hero coming off his first All Star appearance, and Bam Adebayo, Khalil Ware. All these guys are going to be coming together to help the Heat compete. So that's going to be a good team to go against to kind of get your first taste of what it's going to be like for the Bucks in 2025-26. Of course, preseason, we're not going to be caring about the preseason once the actual opening night comes about and we tip off the regular season, but it'll just be good to know. Anyways, after the Miami Heat on the road, they'll return home 3 days later to face the Detroit Pistons, who, in many mocks and power rankings, the Detroit Pistons have ranked maybe 1 or 2 seeds even higher than the Bucks. And I know, according to, I believe, the NBA's official power rankings and then ESPN's power rankings, the Pistons were at 4 or 5, and then the Bucks were at 6. So again, another young and up and coming skilled team that they're going to get a chance to go against. Then the Chicago Bulls on October 12th, and you know you could take up and coming out of that sentence, but young still applies. And again, the Bulls are not going to be competing for anything or going on a deep postseason run anytime soon, but they're going to see how they fare in 25-26 with Modest Buzelis going into his second year, and whatever is left of Kobe White and Ayo Dosunmu if they do hang around, if Vucevic hangs around. But they're just going to see what they can do against a team like the Bucks. And then the final matchup of the preseason for the Bucks will come against the reigning defending NBA champion Oklahoma City Thunder at home on October 14th. So after 3 matchups against, not necessarily the best of the best in the Eastern Conference, but several teams that could make postseason pushes, you're going to be going against the buzzsaw that is the Thunder. And by the time the final preseason contests come around for every team in the NBA, teams and coaching staffs could get a little bit more lenient with how they're playing their star players in these preseason games. Maybe they figure by the end of it, they're going to ramp their guys up and maybe have them play more towards the end of the first half, or maybe even to begin the second half, and then probably sit out for the rest of the third quarter, all of the fourth quarter. But the Oklahoma City Thunder, they're going to get a chance, most likely, to play against the Thunder more or less at full strength and really see what they can do against the defending champions. So after those 3 games against Eastern Conference teams, they're just going to be running into far and away the best team in the league. So that's going to be very interesting. So excited for the preseason. So excited for, just obviously the regular season to come around and actually to have real basketball to talk about. And I can't wait to see you guys there. And moving forward, someone that's probably going to be helping out a lot once meaningful basketball does come around is the veteran guard Gary Harris, who, of course, signed to the Bucks this past offseason. And a lot of talk about Gary Harris has revolved around if he is actually going to be a meaningful contributor in the lineup alongside Giannis, alongside Myles Turner, and playing with the starters more or less in certain packages and spot minutes. And Gary Harris has proven to be a very reliable contributor throughout his career. Of course, with the Denver Nuggets, he was more of a scorer. Got up to about, I believe, 17 points a game, somewhere around, through the first 3, 4 years of his Denver Nuggets tenure. And then, of course, with this past year on the Orlando Magic, he could not really create offense for himself. I mean, he's never really been adept at that to any degree, but this past year for the Magic specifically, it was a struggle on the offensive end for him. And, defensively, what he can give, and that he is dependable on that end of the floor. But Gary Harris, and this is something that Fansided's Dalton Sell pointed out in a recent article, is that he will have a chance to have somewhat of a career revival. It's not like his career is going down the drain and he's, at his wits' end and he doesn't really know what's coming next in his career. But Gary Harris will have a chance to kind of reimagine his game as a supplementary shooter and, a guy that just spots up in the corner for catch and shoot looks. And as Dalton Sell points out in a recent article, basically saying that Gary Harris's career could be placed back on track by playing alongside Giannis, is that he can take after guys like Brooke Lopez, Bobby Portis, even guys like Bryn Forbes, Grayson Allen, Malik Beasley, Gary Trent Jr., AJ Green, and more. And he can have maybe his best year as a shooter alongside Giannis because that's happened to so many players in recent years. And Gary Harris himself, it's not like he's the worst shooter in the world or anything, or he's coming off a terrible year. This past year, again, as Dalton Sell points out, statistically, he was still pretty consistent on wide open 3-point looks. So if Giannis is driving towards the rim, opposing teams are creating a wall to stop him, and Gary Harris is sitting wide open in the corner, he knocked down 44.9% of his 3-point looks when he was considered wide open by the NBA's advanced stats, which, as Sell points out, is being given 6 or more feet of space to shoot. 45% essentially on wide open looks. So it's pretty incredible. And if he can, he can benefit obviously off of Giannis's driving and kicking ability. So we know what he can give on the defensive side of the floor, but will Gary Harris break out, so to speak, and shoot upwards of 38% on threes for the Bucks? It remains to be seen, but if he does, it could really, really impact the Bucks' potential to compete or make somewhat of a deep postseason run. Because when it comes to the playoffs, as we've come to know more and more in recent years, and especially this past postseason run from the Indiana Pacers, from the Oklahoma City Thunder, that it's all about depth, it's all about strength and numbers. And if the Bucks can have guys like Gary Harris stay consistent off of the bench, maybe playing 8 to 12 minutes a game, that can really, really impact things once you get into more of a playoff setting. So hopefully Gary Harris can really contribute in, not necessarily his later years of his career, but he's getting to the point where he's on the wrong side of 30, I believe, maybe he's like 31. And hopefully he's at that point in his career where he's really just locked into helping a team like the Bucks and a player like Giannis compete for a title. And speaking of guys potentially coming in to help Giannis compete for a title, Joe Mayo of the Sporting News, he recently pointed out that there's a possibility to somewhat of an extent that the Bucks can pursue Trae Young as a potential trade target. And I'm not saying that that's a wrong decision or that, I don't know how he could come to this conclusion or that the Bucks could really make this happen, but it's harder to think about when you really realize what the Bucks are working with right now in terms of their trade bait and the contracts that they can move out. Because I was going on like spot track on the trade machine and kind of seeing how this thing would work out, and you would essentially have to move Kyle Kuzma, Bobby Portis, maybe a young guy like Ryan Rollins, who it would be a stab in the heart if you had to let go of a guy like that who was showing great promise and was developing really well on both ends of the floor last year. That would stink to give up a guy like Ryan Rollins. But if they wanted a young guard to replace Trae Young and to kind of get them in the post Trae Young era, uh, they would maybe want a package of that nature. But in terms of moving money, it would be Kuzma, it would be Bobby Portis, maybe a young guy like Ryan Rollins, and then another contract maybe of Torian Prince's caliber, someone like that, to have him return to Atlanta after about a decade. But that would be it, and I don't think, number 1, I don't think that's a package that, also they would probably have to give up the 2031 first round pick because that's, of course, one of the most coveted picks in the NBA, on the trade market, and they would probably have to give that up, and it's n even with all of that, that's probably the Bucks' best offer, and that's not something that the Atlanta Hawks are gonna wanna take back because they've started recently to really fill out their wing rotation with Zachary Risacher and Jalen Johnson probably gonna have an all-star campaign next year. They're not really gonna be interested in that package, so, it I don't know. Of course, Trae Young as the potential incredible playmaker and lob thrower to Giannis and pairing them together as this hypothetical great pick and roll tandem. Of course, it's tempting, but is it realistic? Probably not. But we'll have to see how things progress through the end of this offseason and going into all of next year up to the trade deadline, because who knows, things can change quickly. Maybe Trey Young wants to force his way out if they go into another disappointing year. Maybe he picks out, like, I want to throw lobs to Giannis. That's my main uh destination that I want to go to, and he kind of forces his way out. But that's all hypotheticals and up for interpretation. But the concept of Trey Young and Giannis together and Myles Turner together now surely makes sense. But how the Bucks would get there financially and what they'd be willing to offer or even able to offer is a completely different story. And with that, I feel like we can transition into an article that recently came out from Fanside. It's Tyler Watts, who basically, I mean, it kind of amounts to a hit piece on the Bucks front office. Excuse me, I've been feeling under the weather a little bit lately. But Giannis has apparently been uh, put in an impossible situation by the Bucks front office, by GM John Horst, because their dealings this past offseason were, of course, seen as desperate, waving and stretching Damian Lillard to bring in Myles Turner as kind of a last ditch effort to keep Giannis focused on the present and focused on title contention. Sure, it was a very risky move to make, but Tyler Watts is just, he's not having any of it, and he is, of course, very upset that the Bucks have put Giannis in this position where he has to be the best on the floor in all areas for the Bucks to even have a chance of being competitive. And he says, and I quote, "The Bucks currently need Giannis to be their leading scorer, playmaker, defender, rebounder, and offensive creator. The 30-year-old must do it all for his franchise. Expecting him to make it happen over the 82-game regular season grind and sprint in the playoffs is impossible. Horst has at least tried to put shooting around him, but Giannis can't drop a 30-point triple-double every night." Well, he comes close to it, especially if you're looking at last season. He really does come close to it. Even if he does, it might not be enough with the Bucks' lack of talent. And from my view, I feel like I'd be one to argue that the Bucks, of course, they didn't have to make that decision of waving and stretching Damian Lillard, but after choosing to just rip the band-aid off and knowing you're not going to have him for the entirety of next year, you're bringing a guy like Myles Turner, who just helped the Pacers make a run to the finals and who was one of the best defensive centers, two-way centers in the NBA. You did what you could, and now with how they brought back Gary Trent, they brought back Torian Prince and Ryan Rollins and and Bobby Portis. They did what they could now with the financial limitations that the Lillard wave and stretch brings and will bring throughout the rest of the decade up until 2030. And sure, you could look at this decision in totality and just think, "Oh my, what are the Bucks doing? What was their front office thinking? How were they going to possibly build around Giannis in this state?" But did they really have another choice? Because Damian Lillard was just going to sit on the bench the entire year, and you had a chance to potentially have a guy like Giannis swoop in and recruit Myles Turner over to the dark side to join the Bucks. I don't think that while the $22.5 million of dead cap that's going to be on the books every year until 2030, that's going to be huge in terms of hampering the Bucks, cap limitations and what they're going to be able to do going forward. Bringing in Myles Turner, I don't think was a negative. It might not have completely moved the needle, but it certainly did more than just having Damian Lillard on the bench for an entire season. And then who knows, going into 26, 27, it wasn't guaranteed that Damian Lillard's going to stay at the level that he is right now. So they did what they did with what they had. And I feel as though you could say that the Bucks, and Tyler Watts says in this article that the Bucks are testing Giannis's loyalty, and they're really seeing how much he can go through to be willing to stay with this team. But they did the best with what they could. They made the most out of a bad situation, and that's the way that I'll continue viewing it throughout the 25-26 season, or at least until the trade deadline, where maybe they can make another shakeup to potentially give Giannis a better chance to compete for a title in the 2026 postseason. But, anyways, that'll be it for me today. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching another episode of Bucks Latest presented by Fan Arch. Again, I've been Dean Simon, and make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Still on that road to 1,000 subscribers, so subscribing, I would really appreciate it. And turning on those post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates, I would greatly appreciate that as well. I will see you guys in the next one, and go Bucks.